Just in relation to the banks, how do you manage the banks, or how are they managed in terms of the interaction between the department and particularly, say, AIB, which is generally owned by the state, and the other banks?
I mean, this is handled through the shareholder management unit, which works with Ms. Nolan, and I think it's an ongoing interaction on a sort of daily, weekly basis, perhaps.
Yeah, how does it work?
The way it works in practice, there'll be a formal meeting once a month between the senior management of the bank and the shareholder management unit. You know, as a shareholder, getting an update on what the position is in the bank, and then falling out of that, there'll be ongoing contact about various items that would arise.
What banks are we talking about here?
PTSB and AIB. There's a meeting with Bank of Ireland also, but we wouldn't go into as much detail there because we don't have as big a shareholding. And that's done through the shareholder management unit, and that would be, they would typically take the same kind of questions about profitability, about organisation, strategic direction and so on of the banks as would be taken by any other shareholder, except obviously for our own benefit. In addition, the banking unit in the department has a relationship which is quite separate with all of the banks, whether we have a shareholding in them or not. And this will be on things like SME lending, mortgages and so on. And that would go across all of the major banks, including, say, Ulster Bank or KBC or whoever was the relevant people. And that would be separate to a shareholder and wouldn't be, it's treated separately to the shareholding issue. It has to do with how banking is interacting in the economy.
And what about banks then outside of that? You know, if bank... say Ulster Bank is not in your...
Yeah, but they would deal with the banking unit. The banking unit deals with banks to the extent that the Department of Finance as a department is dealing with the banks separately as a shareholder. So we have the two separated. Our interaction with the banks in which we have a shareholding, which is done through our shareholder management unit, and then the banking issue, where we have interest in how the banks perform, how they provide the lifeblood to the economy, and that's done through the banking division. And the banking division would have the same relationship with Ulster Bank, KBC, and any of the you know, whether we've a bank...
But then, can I ask you, Ms. Nolan, have you a view on how, say, the likes of Ulster Bank sell on their loans? And I won't give you the specific example, but a transaction, say, between Ulster Bank and Cerberus, and the loans within that then that are called in are directly affecting the performance and ownership of some in the SME sector, and where they're treated particularly harshly. In other words, they're attempting to keep up their payments. They're performing as they did when they were with the bank, but now that the loan has been sold on, it's a much more aggressive approach. And the complaint is that there are jobs being threatened, businesses are being threatened, and therefore the jobs, and there's very little flexibility. So as we move along in this process, which is not finished by a long shot yet, you have that type of negative activity going on in the economy, driven by the offloading of bank debt to companies like that.
Okay, just in terms of where it's mortgage debt, obviously we've now passed legislation that the CCMA, the Code of Practice for Mortgage Arrears, applies whether that mortgage is held by the original bank that originated it or somebody who bought it subsequently.
Commercial loans and SMEs.
Commercial loans and SMEs, some of the, I mean, obviously the same legal position, the legal position Cerberus would move into, or any other company. I have no personal knowledge of how Cerberus is treating any particular loan, and I would like to make that very clear. But the legal position that a company which purchases loans is in is exactly the same as the previous bank, though I take your point that there could be issues about attitude and so on. If there are particular issues you want the department to look at, obviously we have no rights to move into that space. We don't have rights as a shareholder either, actually, so it actually doesn't make that much difference whether such a loan originated in a bank in which we have a shareholding or a bank we
didn't. Well, it's just to take a view.
Because a lot of them have been sold anyway. And we would certainly be willing, I mean, we have tried very hard to ensure that the companies who bought those bought loans in the Irish market treat those companies fairly, treat the lenders fairly. So if there's a particular issue that you want me to look into, I'd be perfectly happy
I'm
to take
suggesting that it's particularly aggressive in some cases. I appreciate that it's a difficult part of the market, and banks have to try and get back their money.
The fact is,
but where they're not giving breathing space to some SMEs, where legitimate attempts are being made to sort out their financial difficulties, I think that's causing, downstream, it's causing serious problems for companies because they can't get over this aggressive approach and they can't reach a reasonable position. And surely there must be some way of not ensuring that doesn't happen, because they'll progress anyway, but there has to be some sort of approach to this by the state, by that section within your department.
Certainly that section within our department has been in contact, and we have been in contact with many of the purchasers of loans and have explained what our policy was, which was to help develop loans, particularly SME loans, to ensure they're worked out in a way that protects jobs and protects the economy. We don't have powers to force people to do things. It's private property. If somebody owns a loan, they own the loan, and if the terms and conditions were set down between the two parties when it was set up. But if there is a particular issue that you're aware of, Deputy, that you want to give me information about, I would certainly be willing to talk to the relevant parties to see if there's anything we can do. But the reality is, like the commercial loans are dealt with under commercial law, and we would be at best an influencer on that. And even if we were to change law, it could be very difficult to change it for contracts that have been set up at earlier dates.
I just say to you that the general complaint that I and others would receive is that taxpayers' money, totalling 60 billion odd, went to the banks. They were bailed out with taxpayers' money, and when it comes to giving breathing space to some of the SMEs, no one seems to stand up for them.
Well,
and the other issue is in relation to the lending by banks to the SMEs. I receive complaints from all over the country regarding the attitude of banks towards the SME sector. And I know that you can point to performances within banks and statistics and all the rest of it, but there are business organisations that would question that and that would question how serious the banks are in relation to supporting the SME sector. And I think it's only right that I would say this to you and draw this to your attention, because it's rarely you would meet a business organisation that you wouldn't get a complaint about lending to the SME sector. And I think that it's an issue for the economy, for the Department of Finance, because it all affects the economy. We're trying to grow our economy based on the indigenous sector, 800,000 jobs, and so on, and sustain them. And there is that complaint out there. And the banks, as they get on their feet, are being less than sympathetic to the plight of those trying to restructure, and less than sympathetic to those that are trying to expand their businesses or indeed grow their business. That's my experience.
Yeah, I don't doubt that is your experience. We have put a huge effort into trying to ensure that the banks will provide SME and support, and I know there have been many, hundreds of thousands of SME loans restructured by the banks, all of the banks, AIB in particular, because they had the biggest portfolio of SME loans over the last number of years. Not all of those restructures are necessarily in the way that the owners of the loans would have wanted, but quite a lot of them are, and are performing extremely well now. My understanding is that the NPLs in the banks are falling as a result of these restructures being in place and fixing. And that is not to contradict the fact that there are some people who are unhappy with what has happened. In terms of new lending, our biggest initiative in the last 12 months has been setting up the SBCI, the Strategic Banking Corporation of Ireland, which is providing low-interest loans through the banks and through non-bank financiers to SMEs across the country, and we will be continuing the growth of that over the next 12 months to ensure that SMEs have an alternative, not just to the main banks, but to through leasing companies and so on, of getting low interest loans for developing further.
And can I ask you then, in relation to what Deputy O'Donovan had asked, what steps have we taken in terms of policy and the governance of the country to ensure that we don't have a construction collapse? Similarly, what steps have we taken to ensure that the banks don't get out of hand again?
Well, I suppose
because all the indicators are that as they get back on their feet, they're as cheeky as ever.
Oh, well, I don't think any of the steps will stop them being cheeky, but we have put in steps to ensure they don't get out of hand in the way they did before.
Are any of them getting bonuses in there?
They're not getting bonuses, no. Well, I can't speak for Ulster banks, but certainly the banks that we have, we haven't allowed bonuses in any of the banks we have shareholdings in.
And they're not getting around that in any way, as far as you're concerned?
Not in a broad sense anyway. I mean, there may be one or two cases, I don't know. I couldn't swear to nobody has ever done anything, but certainly we haven't, there haven't been any widespread bonuses. And
is there a difference between a bonus and a retention?
I think there's a small number of special payments that have been made for people where they were moving to the country, for example, from somewhere else to take on a job. And I don't think there's some retention payments in NAMA, but not as far as I know in the banks. And there's obviously retention payments that have been well publicised.
What retention payments are in NAMA?
NAMA, because they are winding down, were given permission to enter into agreements with a certain number of staff that if they stay till whatever date NAMA need them to stay till, that there will be a payment at the end. I don't have the full details, but I can send them to you.
What kind of level of payments are being made to these people?
It's the total amount is 20 million across all of NAMA. The individual
20 million
amount,
of
20 million euro over the next 5 years.
To go towards what?
To go towards repayments, retention payments.
So NAMA are spending 20 million euro?
Yes. They're not spending it yet, but if
no,
people
but
stay, they will spend it.
In terms of retention payments?
But they're actually redundancy payments, but they won't get them unless they stay till the date that suits NAMA. The real danger for an organisation that has a wind down, okay, is that before they go to leave, like your job is ending at the end of next year, but you start looking now for a job. So halfway through next year, NAMA has no staff to finish the job they need doing.
When was that sanction given?
That sanction was given last year. 2000
and what's the number of staff involved?
I don't have all the details. I don't think with me, but I can send you a note on it. It was publicised at the time.
Well,
it's in the public domain.
Yeah.
That's fine.
On it. I'll send you a note on it. I just don't have all the figures with me right now.
And are you satisfied with what's happening in the central bank in terms of retention payments?
Central bank retention payments, we didn't sanction them. They didn't come in to us. It's a matter for the board of the central bank, the central bank commission, to agree those. And I understand that they did communicate with my colleagues in the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, who will be responsible for.
But are these not bonuses by another means?
I think the Deputy Governor over the weekend sort of highlighted some of the challenges for them, which are current and ongoing. The single supervisory mechanism, which is the EU-wide supervisor, is expanding very, very rapidly, and it tends to draw staff out of the existing central banks who still have to continue domestically to exercise their supervisory functions. I think that there have been, the central bank has sort of made public a lot of detail, but it's about trying to keep critical people on a non-recurring basis to give them to retain them in those positions to get projects completed.
Isn't it a fact, Mr. Moore, that if you allow these bonuses under the heading of retention payments, that effectively what you're allowing the central bank to do is to set a sort of a trend where these payments are allowed, and then the whole thing gets out of control, similar to the bonus culture that existed. Now, just bear with me. So if you allow them to say, I'm keeping this employee, I require to pay retention money, I have to pay them retention money, What you're actually doing is driving up the payment for that type of qualification in any other business. So the whole thing gets into a spiral again and can get out of control. And here is the central bank, supposed to be setting good example, now setting an example for banks to follow, and very quickly you're in a situation which is difficult to control.
As I say, my understanding of this, it's a very small number of people in middle ranks based around projects. I mean, the central bank, is encompassed within the remit of the FEMPI legislation in terms of pay. My understanding that is the governor has been in touch with the Department of Public Service saying no payments have been made outside the context of that. And let me be clear. I mean, it's hugely. One of the reasons that we've been able to correct the fiscal position of the state has been, cornerstone of that has been FEMPI, and anything that's done has to be done within the context of that.
That doesn't take from the fact that retention money is being paid, and that there's a risk that other banks will use the same excuse to do the same thing, and you're allowing the pressure to come on at a time when the economy, regardless of its growth, is still in a fragile state. We haven't worked out all of our problems in this economy. And there's a question that I was asked recently as to is it a pension levy within the being paid? And there was a question mark over whether some employees were escaping that. Not paying it for some reason or other. And these are questions that are now being asked. And, permission is being given for this payment. And I think that we're heading down a road that will be hard to control once you have that precedent set. Can I ask one last question? In relation to the €4 billion that's going to be repaid by, is it AIB, and the different payments coming in from the bank, where do they get paid to? Are they paid off directly off the loan, or do they go into just general receipts?
These are the receipts from the restructuring.
Yeah.
They'll be paid into the Exchequer. I think the first tranche is due before the end of the year.
But is there an obligation then, once paid into the Exchequer, that they go against a loan? They don't go into the general take for...
They go into the NTMA, and then what happens is, rather than pay off a loan, my understanding is the NTMA, in anticipation of this, cancelled some of the money raising they intended to do in December.
So it doesn't get spent generally in the state?
No, it doesn't get generally spent. It's used to reduce the debt, but it's just the way they do it. It isn't by paying off a loan, it's by not borrowing when they should have borrowed.
So you let us have a note on the 20 million and the
I'll let you have a note on 20 million. My understanding is that when we agreed that the cap was 20 million, they had 77 expressions of interest. 51 of these have been accepted within that, but I'm not sure whether it probably won't come up to the full 20 million. That
How many have expected?
51 of these applications have been accepted. Yeah. But it's a redundancy payment, because it's paid when the people are leaving, if they stay till the date that it suits NAMA for them to leave.
And you've set aside the 20 million to cover that?
What we've said is that they can spend up to a maximum of 20 million on it.
Obviously that's what they'll do.
What?
Obviously that's what they'll do.
Well, not necessarily. It depends on whether the people
stay. We'll keep an eye on them.
Oh, we'll get annual reports.
There,
and the man beside you there will keep an eye on them. He audits that.
Report to the committee, of course.
Yes. After the deed is done, generally.
That's audit.
I just want to go back to the central bank question I asked again. I just read in reports here, 29-30 people benefit from the bonuses. They're €20,000 each, roughly. Who sets the criteria for that? Who sets down how you qualify for that bonus?
Chairman, I'd have to go get some detail. But my understanding, it would have gone through the Governor's Committee, which is the Senior Management Committee, and approved by the Budget and Remuneration Committee of the Commission. How they identify the jobs, I'm not quite.
And has the board of the bank, central bank?
These payments would have gone to the Audit and Remuneration Committee, and the Audit and Remuneration Committee would have reported to the board of the Commission.
Are you a member of that board?
I am a member of that board, yeah.
And you can't confirm then the number, or who sets down the criteria to qualify?
I'm a member of the board. My first board meeting was September of last year, of September of 14, and this would have been done in the July period. Technically, I took over, but I didn't attend my first board meeting until then. Listen, can I get you more information on a chairman in terms of modalities of how that's done?
I just think, to go back on it again, I think it's a serious development that this is happening, and I'm just interested to know who sets out the criteria to qualify for these bonuses. Because I note in the report from the media that Unite is the union, and they're concerned about this. And again, it goes back to the example of giving example to the banking sector and setting, if you like, the precedent where they can follow this and in other banks and indeed across the economy, and then that drives the pay scale out through to an uncontrollable level. And then, Ms. Nolan, just again to qualify this, you are to confirm this. It was 20 million that you said set aside.
I didn't say 20 million set aside. I said 20 million was the maximum they could spend.
Was the maximum they could spend, and there were 77 expressions of interest.
Yeah.
And 51 have been approved to date.
Yes, that's the figures I have.
But if the 20 million was set aside and there was 77. That would give 260.
No. There was a maximum for each person as well.
What was the maximum?
I honestly, I just don't have the figure with me, and I can't remember. But it was nowhere near 200,000. There was a maximum per person, and there's a whole range. I can get you a note on it because it was.
Well, if you would, because to me that's
no
a staggering.
It certainly isn't 200,000, as I understand it.
Yeah, but it's still an extraordinary amount of money. I have to say, the more I think about it, and the reasons for it, and what people went through in terms of their employment and the legislation, FEMPI and all of that. And now this is beginning to creep in at a level within the banks and within NAMA that gives it the look of, a cosy set of people being looked after. And that when people object to it or talk about it, there's very little detail being given to them. And indeed in the central bank, it's almost being done as a secret arrangement with staff. And I think that the Department of Finance has a role to play in this. If we allow all of this to happen and to slip, we're simply going backwards. That's my honest view on it. I don't think that we're at that stage yet where you can allow something like this to happen, particularly in the banks. You are allowing the wrong message to be sent out. And caution has to be urged here in relation to this, in spite of the challenges that are there, to keep key personnel. I'd like to see who is writing, Mr. Moore, the criteria by which you qualify for all of these bonuses. We're back into the game again.
Just on the NAMA ones, I'd like to say that this is being paid when people leave. It's not a bonus payment that's paid while people are staying.
It doesn't make...
It's paid over time for people if they stay. It is a retention payment.
It's a retention payment.
It's a retention payment.
So therefore it's under a different name. This argument is going to go on now. Banks... I see where in the central bank, for example, that there's a reward model for the central bank being considered. And a consultant has been, or will be, brought on board to deliver this reward model as to what it might look like. And then, you have other people in the central bank bemoaning the public pay restrictions and so on. So, like, who is paying the consultant to do this? Why is the restructuring taking place against this backdrop of disquiet about the amounts of money being paid? You know, it is moving in the one direction as it did before, where the consultant will make the argument stand up because he who pays the piper calls the tune, and lo and behold, he says, or she says, they're all entitled to a bonus, while everyone else in the economy is finding it hard to get their entitlement in terms of a salary or a wage. And I do think that you need to take this on board. I think that that is a serious development that will have consequences across the economy. And I think that if you allow the retention description to creep in, then you're into further descriptions creeping in that will allow further payments to be made, exceptional payments. And that's not where we're at. That's not what I see in the economy. And I think that as a member of the board of the bank, Mr. Morden, you're not accountable to us here in that position, but certainly it's a way of sending a direct message back to the bank that it has a little distance to go and that they should be showing and leading by example in relation to the credit unions and the regulation. And everyone understands the need for regulation, and they're rebuilding their organisation and their different branch structures and so on. But the regulation that's there and that's beginning to have an impact on them is seriously negative, having a negative effect on those that borrow, particularly those that are on the edge between the money lender and the credit union. And the amount of red tape that you have to jump through to actually get a loan from the credit union is so significant now, it's almost creating an inflexibility within the credit union to deal with loans that come before them that can be paid back, but for some reason or other the regulation is preventing it from happening for them. And I think that the credit unions that I have met, they have a case, and you can over-regulate and over-complicate a sector that has done so much good for the country and for those members that it represents. And I think that the fact that the credit union have, I think it's 7 to 9 billion euro in the banks ready to, activate it in terms of house construction or loans to the SMEs, and I'm talking about those single employers or family employers at that level within the SME sector. I think that the department should be proactive in ensuring that that money is released into the economy to a sector that's finding it difficult to borrow.
Well, we certainly would be encouraging the credit union movement to develop in appropriate extra loans, whether it's at the microfinance area, and I know there's a pilot scheme at the moment being run with the Department of Social Protection, and I think it's 25 or 30 credit unions looking at microfinance for those people whom you referred to who would be close to the money lending area, and if that works out it would be great, and also encouraging development of products in the social housing and other areas. I've spoken to the regulator myself on the importance of developing products in those areas.
Okay, and have you had discussions with the public banking forum using the model from Germany in terms of, I think they've been with your section in the department?
There have been some discussions, and I know there was a submission that went to the Minister very recently on it, but I think that's a matter of policy for the Minister and I can't really speak for it.
But you have met the group?
We have met the group.
It has is now at the level of
yeah, I'm just not certain whether the Minister has made a decision or not on it.
Yeah, okay. The letter you mentioned from the revenue, you were referring to it in your replies. Is it possible to have a copy of that letter?
It's on our website, of course. Yeah. We put it on the website. It's important.
Okay. In terms of IBRC then, and that inquiry, and the cost of that inquiry, we were expressing concern here with public expenditure and reform regarding the fact that it's sort of open-ended. Where stands that now?
I understand Mr. Watt provide information to the committee subsequent to us too. The responsible minister, if you will, on that query is the Taoiseach rather than the Minister of Finance, because we're not just sort of witness to but subject to it. So we don't have a role in it, Chairman.
You write the cheque, don't you?
No.
It comes out of the
Taoiseach's vote.
Right. And just in relation to that, because you're responsible for revenue. Revenue collect the taxes. So when you collect that tax and it goes to, say, the Taoiseach's department relative to the payment of IBRC or the payment of the inquiry, do you express a view on it?
That's a matter for the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. Under the rules, we just give a gross amount effectively.
Yeah.
We don't get to express a view on individual items. That was divided between the two.
Minister of Finance, since the bill approves the overall aggregate.
All right, let me put it a different way then. You're responsible for collecting the taxes. Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, the chairman, the revenue commissioners are.
He's for collecting taxes. You set the policy under,
yeah.
so you collect the taxes, or you get the taxes. Are you concerned about what has been revealed over the last 10 years, 15 years by the Comptroller and Auditor General in relation to the poor value for money that is received or that is achieved by some departments? Inefficiencies. Are you satisfied, for example, that the 2.6 billion that comes through it's taxpayers' money, regardless of where it comes to, that will go to Irish Water up to 2016 and not audited by the CNAG, PAC has no input into it? Are you satisfied that the local government audit, which is outside the remit of the PAC and the CNAG, that there's no public scrutiny really of that particular fund? Or the allocations of €6 million to Limerick City of Culture at that time? It's difficult to know who will audit that. So the question I'm asking is, as legislation is being prepared for all of these, for the spending of all of this money, whether it's local government or whether it's Irish Water, why is it that there is not an effort made to ensure, particularly by finance, to ensure that the money collected is spent correctly and that the structures are in place to oversee that spend, by having a Comptroller and Auditor General that can audit these very large figures and that can have a public scrutiny then of those figures and a debate around them? Surely you must have a concern.
So I think, like any public servant, sort of, you have to be concerned to ensure that value for money has been achieved. In 2011, the expenditure allocation functions and I think virtually every function that you described there were reallocated to the Minister of Public Expenditure and Reform and the Department of Finance. Now, yes, we retain the responsibility for tax policy, collection of taxes, the budget, the banking issues, but that element of what we used to do has been separated from us. Of course, we should always endeavour to get best value for money, and where money is allocated, that you ensure that happens. But I think the questions are probably better addressed to my colleague on the foreign.
They're not, Mr. Moran. There are questions that I think should occupy the minds of those in the Department of Finance, because, as well as Mr. Watt's department, because if the mistakes were minimised and things were counted properly, then you might not have as much tax to collect from those that are hard pressed to pay it in the first place. And it's a view. So if within a business the money that you were collecting was being spent incorrectly, you'd soon bring in the head of the department and say, excuse me, I gave you X and you spent part of it very unwisely. I want you to account for it. For example, 13.5 billion going to the HSE, and they don't have a single financial system going back to the dissolution of the health boards and the foundation of the HSE. It's incredible. So I would have thought that you might have a concern for the people that you're collecting taxes from, to say on their behalf to those that are spending it. So you're collecting it by the hard-boiled, and it's being spent by the soft-centred, if you know your sweets. So that's what I think about it. I do think that there should be a concern about what's going on, because the other example I would give you is when it happened in your department, and you might the 7 contracts which totaled €405,000, and procurement rules were not applied fully, I think, is maybe how we would describe it. And in this committee, right across every single department, and particularly in relation to the Department of Education, you will find procurement rules being broken. Yeah, only this morning we had a case where I think you have to go to procurement at €25,000, and the college in question applies a threshold of €50,000, just ignoring completely the department guidelines. So if you're giving money to the Department of Education and they're ignoring guidelines, and I'm not picking on the Department of Education, it happens in other departments as well, and you're not leading, you have a question to answer in relation to 405,000, well then surely you have some obligation to say to that department, you had better shake yourself out of old habits and apply the new rules. The thought just crossed my mind, we should actually have, I must recommend it to whoever might be chairing this committee in the next session, that both departments, public expenditure and reform and finance, should be brought in together to discuss maybe an overview of the Comptroller and Auditor General's report each year, so that we can get a handle on it, because I don't accept that it should be the way it is, whereby you give over the money to public expenditure or to departments. And I won't say you're not concerned about it. I know that you have expressed concern about how it's spent. But from the taxpayer, and particularly businesses that are struggling, they would like to see greater accountability and a greater sense from each department that they clearly understand that these taxes that are collected diligently by revenue are perhaps not being spent with the same diligence and care that revenue applied to the collection of the taxes. And that's my view, having sat here for the last number of years, and my experience from being a member of the committee some years ago. And someone has to bridge that gap. And maybe on the publication of your report every year, Mr. McCarthy, there should be an effort made to have some sort of joint session with both departments to bridge the collection of the taxes, the spending of the taxes, and what's found in the Comptroller and Auditor General's account. Because while we deal with it here every year, it's never truly exposed or debated in Parliament, where it should be debated in a general sense, so that we really get a handle on transparency, accountability, and having the proper systems. It might have ensured, for example, that the appropriate reporting systems within the HSE, that one financial system, was in place a lot sooner. These are the issues that I think should concern us, because what gets counted gets done, and I don't think we're doing it to the greatest extent that is expected nowadays by the individuals that pay their taxes and watch how those taxes are being spent.